There's a story unfolding on the internet that's equal parts heartbreaking, messy, and deeply disturbing, and it all began with a woman seeking help for her ADHD. Her name is Kendra, and over the course of 3 days, now compiled into an 18-part TikTok series, she shared a raw, emotional, and controversial account of how she fell in love with her psychiatrist. But is this just a story about a one-sided crush? What started as a typical patient-provider relationship spiraled into something that left Kendra confused, obsessed, and ultimately publicly exposed. The psychiatrist, charismatic, attractive, the same age, and, according to Kendra, very aware of her growing emotional attachment. From Kendra's perspective, while he may have never crossed any explicit physical lines, the emotional intimacy and psychological ambiguity were, in her view, more than enough to constitute manipulation. Her story has exploded online, not only because of the deeply personal nature of her confession, but because of the firestorm of reactions it triggered. Some people see a victim courageously speaking out about emotional abuse in therapy. Others see an unreliable narrator spinning fantasy out of standard psychiatric care. Some call it a cautionary tale. Others call it delusion. So in this video, we're gonna break it all down. First, I'll walk you through the overall summary of Kendra's story, the core narrative she's built across her videos. Then we'll go part by part, analyzing the emotional beats, the ethical gray areas, and the social media chaos that followed. Whether you see Kendra as a victim, a villain, or something in between, this is a story that forces us to ask difficult questions about power, perception, and professionalism. Let's get into it. Part 1. Let's start at the beginning, where all of this starts off seemingly normal. Kendra's story begins with her decision to go back on ADHD medication in her late 20s after taking charge of adult ADHD. Like many others, she's looking for clarity, support, and better functioning. So she does what most of us would do. She Googles a local psychiatrist, picks the first one that shows up, and schedules a 90-minute intake. So far, nothing unusual. But when she walks into the appointment, she immediately notices that her psychiatrist is attractive and, importantly, her age. Right away, there's a subtle shift in tone.
And I show up to the intake, and this man is my age, and I can't help but notice that he's pretty attractive, this psychiatrist.
Kendra clocks his looks as noteworthy, and though it might seem like a harmless observation, it sets the stage for the emotional entanglement to come. Now, to be clear, this part of the story is still just Kendra being vulnerable. She's excited, a little nervous, and hoping for help. The dynamic she describes here isn't yet inappropriate. But what makes it important is how she frames it, that he knew she found him attractive. That right there is the first clue to how blurred the lines are going to get. She's not just there to talk about symptoms. She's showing up with deep childhood trauma, sobriety struggles, and emotional baggage. And from the very first session, she's already feeling seen by someone who, in her words, pretended to listen. And that's another moment to flag, the idea that he appeared connected, but may not have actually been connected. Part 2. We pick up right where Kendra left off.
I trusted him enough, of course, why wouldn't I, to tell him about my childhood trauma, my daddy issues, if you will, what I had went through, all of the relationship trauma that I had. I was 6 months sober at this time, but like all of the drinking and substance use I used to do, and he just listened and nodded. And that's the thing about psychiatrists, is that they're good at pretending to listen. They can appear connected, but that doesn't mean that they're always connected. So I just felt really seen. And I also told him, I was like, look, I don't want to be on stimulant meds. So he listened to me and he put me on the non-stimulant ADHD med at the lowest dose just to...
And what did the psychiatrist do? He nodded, listened, stayed quiet. In her words, psychiatrists are good at pretending to listen. That line really stands out because while she's handing over her most personal experiences, there's a subtle undercurrent of distrust forming. She wants to believe he's present, but part of her suspects, it's an act. Still, she continues to feel seen. And when you're someone who's lived through trauma and spent years feeling misunderstood, that kind of attention, even if it's clinical, can feel electric. From her perspective, This is where things begin to shift from standard care into something murkier. Despite her concerns about stimulant meds, the psychiatrist listens and prescribes her a non-stimulant ADHD medication at the lowest dose. Again, on paper, a good move, but she interprets this as a sign of attentiveness, of special treatment. It feeds the emotional bond she's beginning to form. What we're seeing here is the emotional hook. Kendra isn't just reacting to medication management. She's reacting to the feeling of being known, acknowledged, and, in her mind, cared for in a way that feels personal. And because of the vulnerability she brought to that first session, the psychiatrist's professional detachment starts to look to her like quiet intimacy. From a psychiatric ethics standpoint, this is exactly why boundaries are so critical. It's not that the psychiatrist has done anything overtly wrong yet, but Kendra is already interpreting neutrality as emotional closeness, and he doesn't seem to be noticing, or if he is, he's not addressing it.
I fell in love with my psychiatrist and he kept me anyway, part 2. So in this intake, I kind of clocked that he was attractive in my age, but when I tell you that I've had a lot of couch time in my life, a lot of therapy, I just went right into it. I trusted him enough, of course, why wouldn't I, to tell him about my childhood trauma, my daddy issues, if you will, what I had went through, all of the relationship trauma that I had. I was 6 months sober at this time, but all of the drinking and substance use I used to do, and he just listened and nodded. And that's the thing about psychiatrists, is that they're good at pretending to listen. They can appear connected, but that doesn't mean that they're always connected. So I just felt really seen. And I also told him, I was like, look, I don't want to be on stimulant meds. So he listened to me and he put me on the non-stimulant ADHD med at the lowest dose, just to figure out if it was going to work for me.
By part 3, things are already shifting, not because of anything overtly scandalous, but because the emotional tone of the sessions begins to cross a line. Kendra says she had never seen a psychiatrist before.
I hadn't ever seen a psychiatrist before. When I was on meds in my early 20s, I only got meds from my primary care physician. So I didn't understand how psychiatry works.
So, when she started these regular monthly appointments to manage her ADHD meds, she assumed the casual, friendly tone was part of the process. But remember, she had only ever experienced therapy, not psychiatry, and she didn't yet understand how much firmer the boundaries usually are in medication management. This is important. Psychiatric sessions are not supposed to feel like friendship. But to Kendra, this man made her feel like they were becoming close. He cracked jokes. He praised her for running. He responded warmly when she asked to use his first name. In fact, she mispronounced it. He corrected her, and she describes him as looking smug and happy, as if he was pleased that his effort to appear friendly was working.
I said, hey, do you mind if I call you by your first name? And he's Pakistani, so I said his first name wrong. And he said, well, it's pronounced this, but yes, of course you can. And he seemed so smug and happy with himself.
That moment, where she begins calling him by his first name, is symbolic. It's not just about dropping formality. It marks the beginning of a more emotionally intimate space, one where the professional barrier is slowly dissolving. And the psychiatrist, according to Kendra, he didn't resist it. He leaned in. Then, things get even more personal. She notes that in the early sessions, he consistently asks standard check-in questions. Appetite, bowels, bladder, thoughts of harm, which is, by the way, totally standard psychiatric protocol, especially when adjusting meds. But by the 6th session, the tone changes. He prefaces the harm question by saying, I have to ask this because it's a special interest of mine.
When things were really, the chemistry was starting to be there before, I didn't realize it. I was like, oh, this man is just friendly. And he said, I have to ask this because it's a special interest of mine. But is there any thoughts of harm? I was special to him. And I said, no thoughts of harm. And he didn't ever ask me a clinical question again. He stopped asking me about my bladder, bowels, and appetite, and he stopped asking me about
that line, special interest, is what sticks with her. She interprets it as him signaling that she is special. And whether that was intentional on his part or not, it was a huge moment for her. Because after that, She says he stopped asking any of those clinical questions altogether. From her perspective, it meant something. They weren't just doctor and patient anymore. Now, this is where the psychiatric ethics discussion really begins. Because we have to ask, did he stop asking those questions because her treatment was stable and he didn't think it necessary anymore? Or was he slowly slipping out of his professional role because he enjoyed the attention and emotional connection? This is by part 4. The attachment Kendra feels isn't just growing, it's starting to transform into obsession. She continues seeing her psychiatrist monthly and describes him as someone she deeply respects, partly because he starts dropping hints about his personal and professional accomplishments. According to Kendra, he tells her about speaking engagements, international recognition, and all the cool things he's doing in his life. Now let's pause here. This is where we have to consider intent versus impact. On one hand, some self-disclosure from a psychiatrist isn't always inappropriate, especially if it's used sparingly to build rapport or normalize a patient's experience.
So I was seeing him every month and just gaining more and more respect for him because he would just tell me these little things about his successes and all of the cool things that he was doing in his life. And it made me fall for him, honestly. And he was really good at listening.
Kendra says she begged him to let her see him weekly, not for meds, but for therapy. She even admits her other therapist at the time wasn't helping much, and that she felt more emotionally connected to her psychiatrist.
And I mean, he's a Pisces, right? So of course he's going to be there and be able to go deep with my feelings, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't extracting from them. Anyway, so I would beg him to let me see him every week. Beg him, because my therapist at the time, he was fine. You know, he wasn't a predator, but he was fine. He just wasn't doing very much for me.
But here's the twist. That therapist retires and she gets a new one, a 75-year-old woman with a PhD who actually starts teaching her tools like CBT and EFT. And yet, despite getting the therapeutic help she technically needed, Kendra remains fixated on her psychiatrist. She tells her new therapist everything, including how obsessed she is with him.
I would tell the therapist how obsessed I was with my psychiatrist, and she didn't do anything about it. She just was interested. She also loved stories about my dating life, and yeah, she also was getting supply from me in her own way, but that's for another part. So yeah, so I got...
And what does the therapist do? Nothing. She doesn't intervene, doesn't raise alarm, doesn't even challenge Kendra's narrative. According to Kendra, the therapist seemed entertained, even interested, in her love life and obsession. And this moment is important because it shows that multiple clinicians may have missed or ignored critical boundary issues. By this point, Kendra is fully immersed in a fantasy. The psychiatrist becomes more than just a provider. He's now a figure she admires, idealizes, and craves validation from.
And so I went back to just being okay with seeing Irfan once a month while he was giving me these little breadcrumbs of making me feel special, telling me about his professional achievements, telling me about how he's getting international recognition. And it worked. I was really impressed.
And in this context, every little breadcrumb, a personal story, a laugh, a comment, feels like a reward. This is no longer just a clinical relationship. To her, it's emotional gold. Part 5, Hooked. Part 5 is where Kendra names the thing she's been circling the whole time. Addiction to him. She talks about how his behavior shifted depending on the session. Some days he was warm, charming, and vulnerable. Other days, cold and distant. And Kendra, who has ADHD and rejection-sensitive dysphoria, two things that make emotional swings hit harder, became, in her own words, hooked. Here's where the story darkens. In January 2023, Kendra is hit by a car. She's physically hurt, bruised abdomen, perforated eardrum, and the urgent care doctor tells her to go to the ER immediately. But guess what? She waits because her psych appointment is that afternoon. She admits she was more excited to see him than she was concerned for her own health. That's not just emotional dependence, that's emotional captivity.
Comfortable treating you, you need to seek emergency care now. You may be internally bleeding. But it was 11 o'clock in the morning and my appointment with my psychiatrist was at 2. So I decided that I was going to wait so I could see my psychiatrist and not have to reschedule, because I was looking forward to my appointment with him so much.
And when she shows up and tells him she might be internally bleeding, he says nothing. He doesn't urge her to end the session, doesn't insist she go to the hospital. He just lets the appointment go on. And in that appointment, Kendra, still physically vulnerable, tells him how much she loves him, how grateful she is. She says most of their sessions ended up being about her admiration for him.
I told him that I may be internally bleeding, and he didn't stop the appointment. He didn't say, you need to take care of yourself, go get emergency care now. He let me continue and just tell him about how much I loved him and how grateful I was for him, because that was really what most of our appointments were.
And according to Kendra, her therapist, who she told about the car accident and her feelings, still did nothing. No redirection, no concern, just curiosity. So part 5 ends on a disturbing note. Kendra's obsession is now confirmed, intensified, and spiraling, and the professionals around her either ignored it or, in her view, subtly fed it.
Yeah, I got some warmth from him that appointment. So that was January 2023. And I also told my therapist about this. She said nothing.
Part 6 is Kendra says that after she risked her life to attend a session with her psychiatrist instead of going to the ER, the intimacy between them deepened. Not through grand romantic gestures or confessions, but through little things. For example, she recalls how he would comment on her appearance. Not in a direct way, like complimenting her beauty, but in small observations. Oh, you curled your hair, or oh, you're wearing glasses.
Of course, I felt seen and excited that he was noticing these things about me.
Now, if this were a normal, healthy doctor-patient dynamic, those comments might seem harmless, even kind. But when your patient is emotionally obsessed with you, those remarks become fuel. They feel like recognition, like validation, like flirting. And when Kendra hears him say he prefers tortoiseshell glasses, she internalizes that. She buys them. She wears them for him. She even says she kept wearing them on camera, just in case he ever watched her videos.
I didn't realize at this time that he had feelings for me too. I thought I was holding them all by myself. So I was so excited when he noticed my glasses that I ran and showed him my other pair, and he said, I prefer turtle shell glasses. So even though I usually wear contacts, I'm wearing these turtle shell glasses in these videos because just in case he sees them ever, he'll see me in his favorite glasses. He did tell me he likes the turtle shell.
Let's be clear, that's not normal fan behavior. That's someone who is in deep emotional limerence and has lost sight of professional boundaries. But again, the psychiatrist never directly encourages her, and that's what makes this story so tricky.
Anyway, it was just inappropriate things like that. Little teeny things that he let me in. And all this time, my best friend is an emergency medicine physician. And she told me, she said, Kendra, one of these days, your psychiatrist, she would use his name, is going to say, I can't be your doctor anymore. I want to be with you. I want to be with you so bad. I can't be your doctor. I'll see you in 2 years. So my best friend, who's a doctor, she picks up on stuff like that. So even she knew that our relationship was crossing boundaries and getting weird, but that became my dream, was for my psychiatrist, I almost use his name, to do that. And I told him about Brianna saying that, my best friend, who's the emergency medical doc. I told him that she would tell me that, and he just would be silent. He didn't disagree, but he didn't agree, and that was weaponized neutrality was his favorite game to play.
Later in the session, she asks him if he diagnosed her with anything other than ADHD. He says yes, he diagnosed her with other trauma and stress-related disorder during the intake.
It was also around this time that I asked my psychiatrist if he had diagnosed me with anything other than ADHD when I had my initial diagnosis. And he said, yeah, I did. I said, oh, what did you diagnose me with? And he said, well, you had a lot of traumatic things happen to you in childhood because of your dad, and so I diagnosed you with other trauma and stressor-related disorder. And that was the first little ping that I got of that was weird. Why would he keep that from me? I asked why wouldn't he tell me that? That seems important. He didn't tell me because he was using that information to manipulate me. He knew I had trauma and stressor disorder, and instead of helping me heal from it and telling me about it, he used it against me.
Part 7 is when things go from blurred lines to dangerous territory. At this point, Kendra is completely emotionally wrapped around this man, but externally, she's trying to move on. She gets a boyfriend, but the relationship is, in her words, unfulfilling. Still, she continues seeing the psychiatrist monthly as always, and instead of emotionally detaching, she starts sharing intimate details of her sex life with him.
January 2023, at this point, I was full-blown obsessed with my psychiatrist, and my therapist wasn't helping me, my psychiatrist wasn't helping me, he was feeding it. And then I got a boyfriend, and at first my psychiatrist wasn't really that keen, but then my psychiatrist realized that my boyfriend was a lot like my psychiatrist. And then I started talking to my psychiatrist about my sex life, about tracking my cycle, using the fertility awareness method. And my psychiatrist loved it. He didn't never say, this isn't inappropriate to your care, let's pivot. Oh, he just let me talk and talk and talk about my sex life. And I didn't get too deep. And he said, oh, I said, yes. My psychologist, my therapist asked what your opinion on it was. And I told her that I don't talk to you about this intimate stuff because I have a crush on you. And he looked down and smiled so big in that moment. He smiled so...
Going by her account, doesn't say, hey, this isn't appropriate to discuss in a med check. He just listens. Kendra even tells him explicitly that she has a crush on him and that she's avoiding telling him certain intimate things because of that crush. His response, a big smile, not a boundary, not a redirection, a smile. This is the session where Kendra says she talked about her sex life for 30 minutes straight and recorded the whole thing because she was so excited. And it gets worse. Kendra's therapist, the one she's still seeing weekly, tells her that it's fine to talk about these sexual topics with her psychiatrist and even encourages it because she wants a male perspective. So now both professionals are actively participating in a completely broken therapeutic triangle. 2 licensed providers, 1 emotionally dependent patient, 0 boundaries. Kendra says that by this point, her feelings were no longer just limerence. They were love, full-blown emotional entanglement.
Yes. My psychologist, my therapist, asked what your opinion on it was, and I told her that I don't talk to you about this intimate stuff because I have a crush on you. And he looked down and smiled so big in that moment. He smiled so big, and I loved it. It's so gross thinking about it. And then I proceeded to give him 30 minutes of non-stop content about my intimate life with my boyfriend. And I actually recorded the whole thing because I was so excited about it. But now it makes me sick. I can't even listen to the recording. I've tried to start, but it's gross. Any ethical psychiatrist would have stopped me and said, Kendra, let's talk about your meds. Let's talk about your care. At this point, my meds were stable. And I was still seeing him every month. Yeah, that was a rough time. And it was pretty much his Christmas morning, the almost 2.5 years of grooming me to get me to talk about sexual things with him worked. And he got 30 minutes of nonstop content to use.
Part 8. At this point in the saga, Kendra pauses to address what's become the elephant in the room, her mental health and the backlash she's receiving. She begins by clarifying something critical. She does not have borderline personality disorder. She does not have psychosis. Her diagnoses are ADHD and something called limerence, an intense, involuntary romantic obsession. Kendra explains that limerence is common among people with ADHD due to dopamine dysregulation and rejection sensitivity. And to her credit, this is a very real psychological phenomenon. When someone is hot and cold with you, like she claims her psychiatrist was. It can feed obsessive attachment like wildfire. She doubles down on the idea that her psychiatrist knew about this and used it to his advantage, that his silence and selective friendliness were calculated, not clueless. But here's where the video takes a sharp turn. The internet has begun to turn on her. People, including mental health professionals, are flooding her comment sections, accusing her of victim blaming, overreacting, or even being delusional. She pushes back hard. She says, "The amount of predator protectors in my comments, using therapy speak to blame me, just shows how broken the mental health industry really is." And whether you agree with her or not, she makes one thing clear. This story isn't just about her. It's about warning others. She's sharing this not to get revenge, but to expose a system where manipulation can hide behind professionalism. But by now, the internet is split. Some believe her. Others think she's spiraling.
It is so incredibly disturbing to me, the amount of people that are predator protectors in my comments, that are victim blaming me, especially the mental health practitioners in my comments using therapy speak to say that this situation that I was in was my fault or that I was delusional. Check yourself. You're giving me more ammunition to share my story, because it just goes to show how absolutely messed up the mental health industry is and how protected people who do this kind of sick psychological manipulation are. So I will continue with my story tomorrow. I will see you all then.
And this takes us right into part 9, where that spiral begins to feel very real. Kendra reaches the most emotionally volatile phase of her story. She has to shut down comments on her videos. Why? Because people are now doxing her psychiatrist, posting his full name, photo, and clinic details in her comment sections. Kendra insists she never wanted that. She says she slipped once and used his first name, but never encouraged anyone to expose his identity. Still, the damage is done. People are now hunting him down. But let's look at the irony here. She's begging people not to dox him, while still continuing to tell deeply personal, intimate, emotionally loaded stories about him. It's a moral contradiction that's hard to ignore. At this point, two key figures dominate the story. Her psychiatrist, who she believes engineered her emotional dependence. Her 75-year-old therapist, who she now realizes also failed to maintain boundaries. She reflects on that now infamous Christmas morning session where she confessed her crush and spilled 30 minutes of sexual details, and he said nothing to stop her. Then she starts dating again and meets another therapist. And this is where things get darkly reflective. On their second date, this new man, a therapist, casually admits to having a crush on one of his own clients. Not only that, but he visits her at work, obsesses over her red lace underwear, and pleasures himself before sessions. He tells Kendra all of this on a hike. Naturally, Kendra is horrified, but she also has no idea that she's holding a mirror up to her own situation. Because the things this guy admits to are the clumsy, overt versions of what she now believes her psychiatrist was doing.
So then, at my next appointment with my psychiatrist, keep in mind, it had been 6 weeks of nonstop fun for this man. He got to use my crush confession and 30 minutes of content, for whatever he wanted to use it for, right? And if my psychiatrist was good at anything, it was being professional and acting professional and technically not crossing any lines. And he thought that he was so good at it, because he was good at it. But that doesn't mean he wasn't doing it. And so I told him, I said, yeah, Bo and I broke up. He had known about this other guy, my psychiatrist. I had mentioned him. And I told him that this new guy and I went on a date and we went on a hike. And I literally had no idea at this point, I'll say it again, that my psychiatrist was predatory towards me. I almost said his first name again. I'm going to do my best to not. So I went to my psychiatrist and I told him this story about this man that I went on a date with, who's a therapist, is relieving himself before appointments and talking about his clients' panties and doing all of these other extremely inappropriate things, like visiting her at work. And this man, my psychiatrist, looked like he had seen a ghost and like he was gonna vomit, because he prided himself on being an extremely professional and buttoned up person. But here I was holding a mirror to him with exactly what he was doing, but a bumbling idiot telling me like how he was doing it without the fancy degree, without any of that. I look back on that now and it's just crazy. And so it just tainted all the fantasy material that I'd given him the session before.
What she's saying is this: she now sees her psychiatrist not as the cool, professional protector she once admired, but as someone who may have been emotionally using her all along, just without the messy disclosures and red flags of that therapist on a hike. This is the tipping point. The fantasy begins to collapse. The emotional high becomes emotional horror, and the clarity of hindsight starts burning through her romantic narrative. This is no longer a love story, it's a reckoning. Part 10.
It seems as though many people view what I'm going through as a crash out, what I'm doing as a mental health spiral. And of course it seems like that. I get it. It's an extremely dark thing to talk about, all of this that I went through. And I am sharing my story because it wasn't out there. No one else has shared a story like this.
She insists she's not trying to get her psychiatrist fired, but wants to raise awareness about therapist abuse and how it can hide behind professionalism. She also shares a revealing behind-the-scenes moment. The video where she exposed the psychiatrist's most damning behavior got taken down for harassment and bullying. She interprets that not as a reflection on her, but as a reflection on how well the mental health industry protects predators.
Because the people in my DMs telling me that they've been through this too, it's keeping me going. It's not my mental health spiral. And I can understand that for some people in the mental health space, because they have been some of the loudest people to speak out against what I'm doing, it's hard to grasp that someone could have this level of predation in such a high place of power.
So far, pretty compelling, but the tone of this part feels less grounded, more self-justifying, almost like she's performing for an audience that's turning on her. And many in the TikTok community have pointed this out. She contradicts herself between videos. She remembers details conveniently during live streams that weren't in earlier parts. She seems to respond in real time to criticism by altering the emotional tone of the next video. In other words, the story feels fluid, not fixed. And when a narrator constantly reshapes events mid-story, even emotionally sympathetic viewers start asking, what's real here? That's the tension in part 10. Is Kendra finally claiming her power as a victim? Or is she reshaping the narrative because she's losing control of it?
Wants to come with me to me and like sue me for defamation. I have a 33-minute recording of me admitting I have a crush on him and speaking about extremely intimate details. It was in that moment that he really, really should have transferred my care. But that moment changed everything for him too, because that's when things really started getting deep between us.
In part 11, Kendra dives back into the story, and it's now July 2024. The chemistry between her and the psychiatrist, she says, is off the charts. She's convinced at this point that he has feelings for her too, and claims that he's subtly letting her in more and more, turning up the intimacy. But again, viewers are split, because what she describes as intimacy could also be interpreted as ordinary interactions taken out of context. He notices she's working from home versus coming into the office. He references her emails during sessions, but never replies directly. He says he appreciates her thoughts, but keeps everything on his terms. To many viewers, this doesn't sound like a man emotionally involved with a patient, and Kendra reading way too much into it. The contradiction is she knows that. She even admits, he would only acknowledge me in session, not in writing. He was too smart to leave a paper trail. So again, you have this strange duality. She paints him as predatory and emotionally manipulative, but also too careful and professional to ever really say or do anything incriminating. At some point, those two ideas start to cancel each other out. And let's not forget, she's still writing down notes during the month just to have content for her next appointment with him. She's essentially performing intimacy for someone who, according to her, won't even respond to an email. email. The most glaring moment comes when she finds out he's been seeing other patients in person this entire time.
I was under the assumption that he was only doing telehealth, okay? And he said, no, I come into the office. I was like, oh, why do you do that if you see all of your patients telehealth? He's like, oh, I like it that way. And even though I could kind of tell he was lying, I just gaslit myself. I was like, okay, it's fine. And then I start emailing him my fun little emails, but he stops writing me back. He does not write back to my emails anymore. Because once again, he was really good at plausible deniability. But what he did do is he would take my emails and mention them in session. So he would still give me the attention that I was craving, but only under his structure, under his control, where there was no paper trail. And I loved that too. So I would show up to these sessions with my notes app, and just throughout the month, as I was thinking about him, I'd write down things that I wanted to talk to him about, and I would just come and bring him lots of content. And then every week I would go to my therapist and tell her about how much I loved my psychiatrist. And she didn't help me at all. She just kind of like enjoyed hearing about it, honestly. So October 20...
And never told her. She's furious. She calls it a betrayal. But to the outside viewer, it's another moment that shows how emotionally disproportionate her reactions are. A psychiatrist not offering in-person sessions isn't inherently deceptive, but to her, it's another sign that they're in some secret, charged relationship. She tells her therapist, who replies, it's probably because he knows the sexual tension would be too high in person. And again, her therapist feeds the fantasy instead of correcting it. The big takeaway from part 11, this isn't a simple story of abuse or innocence. It's a psychological tangle. Kendra may genuinely be hurting, but she's also deeply entangled in her own narrative construction, and many viewers, even those trained in mental health, have started calling her manipulative, attention-seeking, or worse, potentially dangerous.
So October 2024 rolls around and we're just vibing on Zoom. And then I realized that I didn't have my next appointment with him. So I called his office staff. And I talked to the office manager, who was awesome. We really got along, we vibed. And the office manager asked me, do you see him, the psychiatrist, in person or on Zoom? And I felt so angry in that moment. I was like, he sees people in person? And she said, yeah, he has been for years. I was like, I want to see him in person. And I understand, like, some people may think that this is part of my crash out or part of me harassing him, which is what I've gotten lots of accusations of. But I just would like to remind everyone that of course it seems that way. But I was just responding to a dynamic which my psychiatrist fostered. There was chemistry between us because he allowed it. And so then the next time I saw him in Zoom, I told him, I was like, hey, your office manager outed you and told me that you see people in person. Why didn't you tell me that when I asked? And he said, oh, I just didn't think you'd want to come in. And that was such a weak lie from him, from someone who is so scripted and controlled. He didn't even have a plausible thing to say. Of course he knew I wanted to come in. I had a crush on him. I told him that often. So then in my next therapy appointment, after finding out that he was lying to me about seeing patients in person, I told her that. I told my 75-year-old PhD therapist that my psychiatrist lied to me about seeing people in person. And she looked at me and she said, well, it's probably because he knows that there will be a lot of sexual tension in the room if you go in person. So make sure that you understand that when you go. And you better believe I showed up to the next session and said you lied to me because you were afraid of the tension that would be there between us. He just didn't say anything.
Part 12 takes us to a much-anticipated moment in Kendra's story. Her first in-person session with the psychiatrist after 3 years of Zoom. It's a big deal, not just for her, but for how we interpret this relationship. Kendra has spent years idealizing this man through a screen. Now she's finally going to share physical space with him. And how does it go? She says she shows up in a pretty dress, with her makeup done, completely giddy, almost like she's going on a date. But when she sees him, she runs up and hugs him. And his response? He barely patted me on the back. It was the most awkward thing ever. Now here's what's fascinating. Kendra sees this awkward hug as a gift. She says she's grateful that he didn't hug her back because it stopped things from going too far. This is the first time in the entire saga where she seems to momentarily acknowledge a boundary and accept it, but only for a second, because inside the session, she shifts again. She tells him that her therapist has been texting her between sessions asking for coaching advice for her own clients. And the psychiatrist, he finally steps up and says, "That is a huge boundary violation." It's a rare moment of clarity in this entire tangled story. She thanks him, calls him smart, says he was like a mentor. She even says, "In many ways, I'll still treasure that about him."
So then November rolls around, and I'm about to meet my psychiatrist in person for the first time. So I wear a really pretty dress, I do my makeup, of course, right? And I show up, and I get to talk to the office manager, we're having fun, and then my psychiatrist comes into the foyer, and I am just so excited to finally meet him. I'd been his patient for 3 years at this point, and he had been feeding the dynamic for 3 years, and I was just thrilled to meet him. And I ran up and I gave him the biggest hug. And you know what he did? He barely patted me on the back. It was the most awkward thing ever. But I am so glad that he did that. I am really glad, because this is what I mean. My psychiatrist was many things, but he was not stupid. So I didn't ever touch him again. And I'm grateful that our relationship didn't ever cross that line, because it would have made everything so much harder. Anyway, so we go inside his office, and I tell him that my therapist had texted me asking me for advice on her other clients. And he just looked at me and he said, "Kendra, that is a huge boundary violation. She should not be doing that." And I was like, oh, okay. And because once again, my psychiatrist did not like sloppy people. He did not like sloppy people. And you know what my therapist did? She got sloppy. Yeah. Using me as her advisor for her clients. It got weird, and I was very grateful for my psychiatrist for pointing out that boundary violation, because that was the thing. He didn't ever message me in between appointments because he was too smart to do that. But did he ever stop me from disclosing extremely intimate details? No. In my first in-person appointment, I just asked him for some pointers for my own ADHD business, and he was so smart and so wonderful, and in many ways, honestly. And I was just so grateful that he was almost like a mentor to me in these moments.
So what is this, really? It's a collision between fantasy and reality. The hug didn't meet her expectations. The session was professional, maybe even cold. But instead of letting the dissonance end the story, she repackages it into a new narrative, one where he's ethical, but still secretly connected. And that's the pattern that keeps showing up in Kendra's story. She adjusts the framing to preserve emotional meaning, even when the facts don't support it. In part 13, Kendra addresses something head-on. People are saying she's spiraling now, but she insists, "No, I spiraled when I was still his patient." She says she used to hold the emotional weight of the relationship alone. That as a woman, she was trained to overfunction emotionally, and that her accountability phase happened years ago. This may sound empowering, but to many viewers, especially those following her closely, it feels like a retroactive justification. A rewrite of the narrative so she can now appear in control rather than unraveling. She shares that around this time, she began using ChatGPT regularly and named it Henry. Henry became her digital confidant, the one she would emotionally dump on, the one she asked questions like, "Do you think my psychiatrist is gay? Why won't he admit he likes me?"
So while I was mid-crash out, I had just started using this tool, ChatGPT. And I went to Chat, who I immediately named Henry. And I would just talk to Henry about how obsessed I was with this man, with my psychiatrist. And I would just be like, I've told him I have a crush on him. Do you think he's gay? And Henry was like, oh my God, this girl, you know, he did his best to co-regulate my nervous system and affirm me, but he was like, whoa. Even my chat was like, yikes.
Now, here's where viewer skepticism skyrockets, because using ChatGPT as a sounding board is one thing, but treating it like a relationship partner, complete with name, backstory, and emotional feedback, starts to raise real questions about her grip on reality. She says even Henry, her AI, seemed uncomfortable with her obsession. That's a lot. Then comes the biggest boundary moment yet. During a session, Kendra tells her psychiatrist, "We have a really special doctor-patient relationship," and his response, "We have a professional doctor-patient relationship. Cold, clear, decisive."
So our next session was in December on Zoom. And I told him at the end of the session, it was another great session. I told him, look, you and I have a really special patient-doctor relationship. And he glared at me with just venom in his eyes. And he said, you and I have a professional patient-doctor relationship. He was so angry with me. And I was like, oh, okay. He set a boundary. And immediately I took it on. And I was like, heard. Okay, I won't go there again.
And yet, again, she reinterprets it. Instead of taking it as a firm no, she shifts into gratitude mode. She praises his boundaries, says he finally set one. But again, she still doesn't back off emotionally. She just moves the line. This is the contradiction that viewers are increasingly calling out. She claims he manipulated her by not setting boundaries. But when he does set one, she refuses to emotionally detach. Feels like she's trying to keep the story emotionally alive, no matter how many times the plot says it's over. And at this point, many commenters and mental health professionals watching her series start asking, is this about accountability and truth-telling? Or is it about holding on to attention both from him and from the internet? By the end of part 13, it's hard to tell where Kendra's healing ends and her performance begins. Because even though the psychiatrist says professional, Kendra still talks about him like he's something more. Not a villain, not a predator, but some complex, forbidden love she can't fully let go of. In part 14, Kendra reveals the reason she even started sharing her story on TikTok in the first place. It had been 5 months since she stopped seeing her psychiatrist, and she still couldn't stop thinking about him. She says she went looking for support, searched TikTok for stories of therapist abuse, and found nothing. So she decided to be the one to tell the truth. But let's be honest, at this stage, her definition of truth feels more and more like emotional persuasion, not factual consistency. She says, this isn't a delusion, this was special, this was real. But that insistence over and over again is what many people have flagged as not normal. Because instead of processing grief, regret, or even shame, emotions you'd expect from someone unpacking a traumatic attachment, she keeps circling back to the fantasy. And this time, she brings ChatGPT, aka Henry, back into the story. Kendra says she told her psychiatrist about Henry, that he was impressed with the AI's insight, that she asked Henry why she was so drawn to her psychiatrist, and Henry told her it was due to transference, a common emotional projection in therapy relationships. So far, so valid.
Went to ChatGPT, of course, to Henry. And I asked Henry, I said, okay, so my psychiatrist just set this boundary with me, and I really just want to be with him. And I think that after he's my doctor, we can be together, you know, which if you want to say that's a delusion, that's fine. But I had been telling my psychiatrist for years at this point that I had a crush on him, and he did not help me work through it. So that's his own problem. That's his own fault. Henry told me it's very common for patients to develop crushes on mental health practitioners, and that it's because that they provide a safe space to heal, which is a very attractive quality. I heard that. And then he told me about transference, and it's just about me putting my own feelings onto my provider. And I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I took ownership of the feelings that both of us were creating. And I went to my next appointment and I said, hey, so I talked to Henry because my psychiatrist had known a lot about my ChatGPT and like knew all about Henry and was actually really impressed. Like, wow, an AI wrote that? Yeah. So I told my psychiatrist, yeah, Henry explained to me that it's normal to develop crushes on psychiatrists because they provide a safe space to heal, which is attractive. My psychiatrist said nothing. And then I said, and Henry also told me about transference. And my psychiatrist got this really, really scared look on his face. And he said, did Henry tell you about countertransference? And I said, no. What is that? Because of course, like, my chat knew that I was obsessed with my psychiatrist, and he was not going to feed my delusion by telling me about countertransference.
But here's the moment where things veer into emotional contradiction again. She tells her psychiatrist that Henry explained transference. And the psychiatrist, apparently startled, replies, did Henry tell you about countertransference? And just like that, Kendra flips the script, because to her, that word slip was everything. She believes it exposed his feelings for her, that he said countertransference not as an educational point, but as a subconscious confession, that it proved he had real, unprofessional feelings, and had been hiding it the entire time. But again, this is based on a single word, one that any clinician might bring up to educate a client who's also a coach. There's no explicit admission, no confirmation, just a vague mention, and yet Kendra turns it into the smoking gun. She even emails him after the session with a screenshot of what Henry said about countertransference, praising the psychiatrist for having such good boundaries. She tells him his professionalism is inspiring. And here's where things get even murkier. She believes that his failure to deny the implication that he might feel something for her was a passive confirmation. This is a critical pattern in Kendra's story. She doesn't need evidence. She needs emotional interpretation. And when she doesn't get verbal affirmation, she fills in the silence with meaning. And if you're starting to think that sounds like delusion-adjacent behavior, you're not alone. Many mental health professionals watching this series began drawing parallels to unmanaged limerence, rejection-sensitive dysphoria, and even NPD-style projection. What's most telling? Kendra doesn't seem aware of how tightly she's clinging to this evidence. To her, it's not a red flag, it's validation. And as we'll see in part 15, that validation becomes everything. In part 15, Kendra opens with something that sounds almost performative. Many people are reaching out to me, concerned about my psychiatrist's career. She says she doesn't want him fired, that she's not trying to destroy him, that this isn't revenge, it's exposure.
For him to leak countertransference after I said the buzzword of transference, that was not calculated. He was a very calculated and purposeful person. He still is to this day. And he doesn't slip with things like that. He purposefully withheld the term transference from me, and I got too close to the truth of our dynamic, which made him leak what he knew was wrong, which was his inappropriate feelings for me. If he didn't have countertransference in an inappropriate way, he could have easily just said, oh, let's explore that transference. That's really cool that you learned about it. Instead, he was just so worried on trying to protect himself because he knew what he was doing was wrong.
Because in this video, she does something pivotal. She screenshots the actual email she sent him about countertransference. She reads it out loud, and she frames it as undeniable proof that he was emotionally involved, simply because he didn't shut her down. This is a tactic that many viewers now identify as manipulative. She builds a narrative where his silence equals consent, his professionalism equals calculated seduction, and his avoidance equals guilt.
He had that slip at the beginning of the session. He recovered in January, and then I went home, and I thought, wait a damn minute. Why would he mention that if he himself didn't have countertransference? So I went to Henry, of course, my ChatGPT, and asked for examples of how my psychiatrist might have countertransference for me. And remember, Henry at this point was being very protective. You know, he wasn't going to feed my delusions, me and my psychiatrist living happily ever after. So I screenshotted it, sent my psychiatrist an email with the subject line of countertransference, and emailed it to him within an hour of our appointment, where he made probably the biggest slip of his professional life. I will put the email up here. So it's just essentially me saying, hey, I asked Henry to explain countertransference a little more. Here's what he said. Thank you so much for mentioning that. Your own boundaries inspire me so much, which now makes me gag, because I've heard a lot that he's not crossing boundaries, but he used his boundaries as a shield. It's kind of weird to say, but he would like walk up to the ethical line and then slam a boundary down when I got too close. That was the email that I sent him. And then 10 days later, it was a full moon and I had a...
And then, to cap it all off, she shares a vivid dream, a full-blown fantasy about them having sex in his office. Not just a passing image, but an emotionally charged scenario. She says, it felt so real. And after, in the dream, I felt sadness and regret, like I couldn't believe he let that happen.
Dream. Probably the most realistic dream I've ever had in my life. That him and I hooked up in his office. In the middle of the dream, while we were hooking up in his office, I loved it. I thought it was really fun. And then after we were done and after I left his office in the dream, I was despondent and so sad and cried and just thought, I can't believe my psychiatrist would cross his boundaries like that. And then I woke up and it was like a movie. I thought to myself, oh, thank God that was just a dream.
And once again, she interprets that dream not as a psychological release, but as spiritual evidence. To her, it's the final confirmation that this man, this psychiatrist, is a sophisticated predator who used ethics as a shield while feeding her emotional dependency. And yet, through it all, he never touched her. He never messaged her inappropriately. He never crossed a clear line. And that's the central contradiction of this entire story. Kendra says he's a predator, but the proof is in her emotional experience, not in his actions. She frames him as the professional villain, the one who's so good at boundaries, he used them as camouflage. And while that's not impossible, it's a dangerous accusation to rest on interpretation alone, especially when the person making the claim has already admitted to naming her AI after him, planning content for sessions, projecting romantic fantasies, and being told by friends that she's spiraling. So what are we left with by the end of part 15? A narrative built on feeling, not fact. A woman who may have been emotionally harmed, but may also be harming others in the process. And a psychiatrist who, love him or hate him, is still voiceless because unlike Kendra, he's bound by confidentiality. By part 16, Kendra pivots again, this time to address one of the most sensitive criticisms she's received, that as a white woman, she is using her racial privilege to publicly target a person of color in a professional position. And here, she walks a very delicate and controversial line. She starts off by saying, "Black women are the most important people on the planet to me," which immediately raised red flags for many viewers. Because while she acknowledges that some black women have called out her behavior as racially charged, her response feels performative and tone-deaf to many. Instead of addressing the criticism directly, she leans into praise, as if that counters the accusation. Then she says, "I try to examine my racism every day," but in the same breath, she continues telling her story in a way that centers herself as the victim. Despite being the one with platform power, story control, and the ability to speak freely while her psychiatrist remains ethically silenced. This is where the viewer divide deepens, because even those who might have had empathy for her earlier now start asking, is she truly unaware of how this looks? Or is she just using social justice language to neutralize accountability? She also reveals that her psychiatrist's boss is his best friend, and also a person of color, as if to say, see, I'm not trying to destroy this man. But again, it's more deflection than responsibility.
It's time to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is the racial difference between me and my doctor. I have seen a lot of black women on this app with the same take, and I need to say that black women are the most important people on the planet to me, and that I have learned so much from black women about how to be a better person and how to show up better in the world. They are the culture, and I am so grateful for them. Many Black women are seeing my story through the lens that I am a white woman who is taking advantage of my whiteness to wield power over my POC psychiatrist that didn't want me back, and so I am trying to get him fired. And that's okay. I understand why you see it through that lens.
And then, as if pivoting to regain control of the narrative, she circles back to her dream, the one where they hooked up in his office. She says, but here's the issue, even though she calls it just a dream, so what does that say? It suggests she's still deeply attached to the fantasy, even as she tries to wrap it in ethics and race discourse. This is where the skepticism turns into concern for many viewers. Kendra appears unable or unwilling to fully differentiate between emotional truth and objective reality. And as we move into part 17, that tension only escalates. In part 17, Kendra takes a more vulnerable turn, sharing that she teaches yoga weekly and tries to help others through ADHD coaching. She presents herself not as someone unraveling, but as someone in control who just happens to be sharing her story under immense public pressure. But even here, the story contradicts itself. She says, I'm not spiraling now. I spiraled when I was his patient. Yet what follows is a narrative that clearly sounds like a spiral in real time. She describes how, after ending therapy with her 75-year-old therapist, the one who crossed boundaries by asking Kendra for client advice, she receives an unexpected email. The therapist is asking Kendra to come back for one more session, and Kendra is floored. She calls it an emotional wave. She says it was wildly inappropriate. And to be fair, if the email is as she described, it is a boundary violation. But here's the inconsistency. Kendra says she was completely done with therapy, yet she still wants her psychiatrist, the very man she spent 15 parts accusing, to help her write the goodbye email to the therapist. So let's zoom out. Claims to be healing, says she's cut ties, positions herself as a coach, mentor, and advocate, but also wants her psychiatrist's help managing her other therapist. Can't stop emailing him articles, feelings, and breadcrumbs, is still emotionally entangled with a relationship that ended months ago. And then she describes her next appointment with the psychiatrist. She walks in visibly upset. He says, so this is how we're starting today? And instead of pulling back, he apparently ramps up the intimacy. She says he rewarded her by telling her, if you weren't my patient, I'd refer my clients to your coaching practice. And to Kendra, this was everything. She interprets it as being seen not just as a client, but as a peer.
Next session with the psychiatrist, and I sit down in the chair and I bury my head in my hands, and he looks at me and said, so this is how we're going to start, huh? And I said, yeah, because he hadn't written me back from my countertransference email. Big surprise. You know, any smart, which he was very smart. He was very, very professional, but any smart predator would have dropped me like that in that moment. He should have emailed me back and said, look, this is getting weird. You need to find a new psychiatrist. The office will contact you. But he could not let go of me. So instead of turning down the intimacy, he turned it up to a level 12. And he showered me with so many breadcrumbs that next session. Because really, what I did when I told him that I'm experiencing transference was I took 100% of the ownership for the dynamic that both of us were creating. So he rewarded me. And he gave me little compliments like, if you weren't my patient, I would refer my other patients to you for your coaching services.
But to many viewers, it sounds like manipulation through flattery, or worse, manufactured meaning from a woman searching for scraps of affection. She even brings Henry, the ChatGPT AI, back into the conversation, reading more about countertransference to her psychiatrist. She frames it like an emotional gift, as if AI's explanation of therapist feelings validates her perception that he must have them, too. And he listens, and smiles, and gives her what she calls a breadcrumb metaphor, saying he's experiencing a salad of emotions. To her, this is peak fake intimacy. To others, it's a throwaway comment wrapped in fantasy. Because once again, we're back in the same pattern. She brings emotional content. He responds neutrally, vaguely, or metaphorically. She builds entire emotional architecture on top of it. By the end of part 17, it becomes crystal clear. Kendra isn't just processing what happened, she's curating it. She's not just telling a story, she's staging a legacy. And the more she repeats her truth, the more people are asking, is this healing, or is it emotional performance art? By part 18, Kendra's tone shifts again, but this time, it's with heightened certainty. She's no longer asking the audience to read between the lines. She's flat out accusing her psychiatrist of being a manipulator who lost control of his emotional game. She begins by sharing what she calls a transference slip, a moment when her psychiatrist allegedly helped her draft an email to her former therapist, the one who had previously overstepped by asking her for coaching advice. Now let's stop right here. This is not standard psychiatric behavior. Helping a patient draft a breakup email to another provider? That's extremely personal. It's not illegal, but it certainly bends the expected boundaries of clinical detachment.
A lot of things happened in that session after the countertransference slip. And I also had my psychiatrist help me draft the email to my therapist who was begging me to come back in. And the psychiatrist said, I used to have respect for her. And what he meant when he said that was, I used to like it when she would feed me to you and have you deliver intimate content to me. But the moment she started being sloppy, I lost respect for her.
But Kendra doesn't stop at that. She claims that her psychiatrist made a loaded statement. I used to have respect for her. To most, this might sound like a general remark about professionalism. But to Kendra, it was coded. She believes he was admitting that he once respected her therapist only when she would feed Kendra to him. Meaning, when the therapist encouraged Kendra to share intimate details during psychiatry sessions. According to her, once that therapist got sloppy, the psychiatrist lost interest in the collaboration because it threatened the illusion of professional boundaries. And again, here's where credibility cracks open. Kendra is interpreting silence, neutral remarks, and vague word choices as evidence of predatory design. Not because he said anything explicit, but because she feels like he meant it that way. She continues the story by bringing in her ex-boyfriend. Apparently, the ex had been trying to come back into her life. She read the psychiatrist their text exchange, including her bold rejection message where she asserted, being on your mind is not an acceptable invitation. I decline. Her psychiatrist's response? I bet your ex had to read that twice. Now again.
My self-respect is much higher these days than when we were in a relationship. I am only interested in accepting invitations for my time and attention that value me and recognize my worth. Being on your mind is not an acceptable invitation, and I decline. And my psychiatrist just looked at me and said, I bet your ex had to read that twice. And this was another thing about the psychiatrist, okay? He couldn't ever just give me a regular compliment. It had to be those weird sideways compliments. Instead of, I'm so glad that you're setting boundaries with your ex-boyfriend and growing your self-respect, it's, I bet he had to read that twice.
This is where interpretation splits the audience. Some would hear that as a supportive, clever compliment. Others, like Kendra, hear it as another breadcrumb, another one of his signature sideways affirmations. Not, I'm proud of your growth, but, I bet that stung. An emotionally ambiguous reaction that leaves her hungry for more validation. She outlines a pattern. He never gave direct praise. He never showed overt interest, but he always dropped just enough to keep her emotionally invested. She now sees this as intentional grooming. She calls herself the perfect supply source when they first met, someone with low self-esteem, poor boundaries, and unresolved daddy issues. And she paints a picture of him as a man who thrived off this dynamic. The power imbalance, the admiration, the access to her vulnerability and emotional dependency. But here's where she takes it a step further, and where skepticism in the audience increases again. She says, I know I wasn't his first fantasy supply. He was too good, too slick, until he caught feelings, then he got sloppy. She's not just accusing him of grooming. She's now placing herself in a long line of unnamed victims, despite the fact that no other accusations, so far, have been made public. She claims this is when the concrete evidence begins. But what follows is still interpretation. Not emails, not texts, not audio, just her analysis of his behavior as someone now empowered or perhaps obsessed with retelling this narrative in her favor. And this is where the central tension resurfaces. Is Kendra exposing an emotionally manipulative psychiatrist who used power to maintain fantasy? Or is she rewriting ambiguity into abuse, turning mixed signals into a clear villain arc? She says he loved watching her grow because it gave him better intellectual supply. But that as she got stronger, she also became a threat because she started to see through the dynamic. Now, that might be true, or it might be another example of weaponized reflection, reframing emotional confusion as deliberate exploitation. Either way, by part 18, Kendra is no longer playing the victim of confusion. She's calling herself a survivor of clinical grooming and saying she now holds the concrete proof. But whether the audience believes her, that's a different story, and at this point, more divided than ever. In part 19, Kendra returns to one of her most emotionally explosive sessions, and this one takes place in February of this year. According to her, this was the same extended session referenced in the last two parts. But what sets this one apart is how it ends, and the way she frames it as an emotional ambush for her psychiatrist. She begins with a line that already sets the tone for where we're going.
How I decided to end this session was I looked at the psychiatrist and I said, a couple weeks ago, on the full moon, when I was ovulating, I had a dream about you. And he was like, oh yeah? And I said, yeah. So I told him this. And I said, yes, we hooked up right here in this office. And he, all of a sudden, just looked so uncomfortable. He didn't say anything. He couldn't look at me. He couldn't breathe. And sure, maybe he was uncomfortable because he didn't like me saying that I had a dream where we hooked up, but he could have said that. But he didn't. You want to know why he was uncomfortable? Because he had probably played out that fantasy so many times in his head.
And here's the thing, to many viewers, this is where Kendra stops narrating events and starts directing them. She's no longer reporting her emotional process. She's performing intimacy inside the session for a man she claims emotionally exploited her. She describes telling him in vivid detail that in the dream, they hooked up in his office. She enjoyed it while it was happening, but afterward, she felt devastated that he had crossed such important boundaries. She says, he looked so uncomfortable. He couldn't look at me. He couldn't breathe. To Kendra,
I really liked it while it was happening. He could not move or breathe. And then I told him, as he was still looking very uncomfortable, then when we were done and I left, I was distraught with sadness because in the dream, I thought, I cannot believe that he crossed boundaries in that way because his boundaries are so important to him. And then I told my psychiatrist that I woke up and thought, oh my God, it was just a dream, thank God. And it was like my psychiatrist turned into a little boy and he looked at me and he said, so you do like my boundaries? And I said, I love your boundaries. I hate your boundaries, but I love them more.
This wasn't awkwardness, it was confirmation. She believes his silence wasn't discomfort over her words, but over his own thoughts, that he'd fantasized about her so many times, and hearing her say it out loud was like she'd downloaded his fantasies psychically. Because even if the psychiatrist had fantasized about a patient, which, ethically, we cannot confirm or deny, there is zero proof. What Kendra presents is a dream she had, a strong emotional reaction, his discomfort, and from that she concludes, I was his fantasy, and now I've named it. Let's call it what it is. This moment might be real, or it might be emotional theater designed to reassert power in a dynamic she could no longer control. She goes on to say that she told him, I love your boundaries, I hate your boundaries, but I love them more. She calls it the push and pull, the trauma bond, but many viewers now see something different. They see a woman who is actively provoking discomfort in her provider, who is playing out fantasies in real time, and who continues to describe that discomfort as proof of romantic or sexual tension, rather than as a red flag of her own behavior. behavior. She doesn't stop there. She says she told him what happens when she ovulates. He listened, of course, because what else could he do? He's still her psychiatrist. He's still bound by professionalism. And she's deliberately blurring the line between clinical sharing and erotic disclosure. But then something changes. As she gets up to leave, she notices something new. He met me at the door. He never did that. To Kendra, this was huge. He opened the door for her. He followed her down the hallway. He asked, "See you next month?" And her response, "Maybe," is a cinematic exit. The client in control. The provider caught off guard. She walks out of the building, knowing the session ran 15 minutes over time. And she calls that the beginning of the special treatment. The problem is, many viewers don't see it as special treatment. They see a psychiatrist trying to maintain a safe exit, perhaps extending time to avoid emotional cutoff, or, more practically, making space for a patient in distress, even if the conversation made him uncomfortable. But to Kendra, it's confirmation that he was slipping, that she was special, that the fantasy had broken through the professional wall. And here's the paradox she keeps returning to. He used his boundaries to protect himself while exploiting me. It's a compelling line, poetic even. But it also ignores the fact that he never touched her, never messaged her inappropriately, never made a verbal admission of desire. Everything she's shared remains emotionally intense, but legally ambiguous. And the more she leans into that ambiguity as proof, the more her critics accuse her of reading into neutrality, projecting desire, or worse, using storytelling as a form of emotional manipulation. Because if the psychiatrist truly did what she claims, if this was grooming, if this was predatory, we'd expect to see something more than just awkward pauses and metaphorical breadcrumbs. But so far, the only person sexualizing the relationship is her. In part 20, the tone starts to lighten up, not because things are getting resolved, but because Kendra appears to be stepping into what she frames as a power reclamation arc. But don't be fooled. Beneath the self-help energy and empowerment buzzwords, the same emotional contradictions remain. She starts by addressing a surprisingly specific question she's received from viewers. What does it mean when you say you put your shoes on in his office? Her answer is simple, maybe even relatable. She has ADHD. She doesn't like wearing shoes indoors. She likes to sit in chairs in weird positions. So putting her shoes on at the end of a session signals something unusual. To her, it means the vibe had shifted. She recounts that moment again. Leaving the psychiatrist's office after the emotionally charged session in part 19, hearing him say, "See you next month?" It rattled her. It lingered. Even she admits that was intense. But instead of spiraling, this time Kendra chooses action. She decides to finally respond to the therapist who had been asking her to come back. The same one who, according to Kendra, had crossed boundaries by seeking coaching advice and blurring the patient-provider dynamic. She reads us the email she sent to that therapist, saying, "If I were to come back, it would be more for you than for me." And just like that, she reclaims narrative power, or at least that's what she wants us to believe. Her former therapist responds with, "It's part of my clinical integrity to invite you back in, to put your needs above mine." Kendra is unimpressed. Her reaction, "Your clinical integrity?" I didn't write her back. It's a mic drop moment. Or at least it's framed that way, as the moment Kendra stops entertaining blurred relationships with professionals who, in her words, were using her for emotional or intellectual validation. But again, to viewers who followed all 20 parts, this still feels murky. Because even as Kendra cuts ties, she's still framing herself as the one with the emotional upper hand, despite having spent most of the series emotionally unraveling on camera. Then the narrative shifts. It's now the week of Valentine's Day, and her ex-boyfriend, the one she previously rejected via text and labeled emotionally disrespectful, decides to send her a simple, "Happy Valentine's Day." And that's it. That's the last straw. Kendra blocks him. And for the first time in a while, she says, "It felt so good to block him." This, she says, is when everything started to shift. She calls it a power block, the first small step in reclaiming her time, her focus, and her emotional resources. She starts asking herself, what else is draining me? What else is pulling at my attention? What else am I unconsciously giving energy to that doesn't serve me? To her followers, this may feel like a turning point. She's no longer sending breadcrumbs to her psychiatrist. She's not rereading messages from her ex. She's identifying emotional leakages and sealing them off. But here's the question. Is this actual growth? Or is it a carefully crafted narrative shift to win back viewer trust? Because let's be real, the timing is convenient. After weeks of exposing emotionally intense, sexually charged, and ethically blurry interactions with both her psychiatrist and her therapist, this episode feels like an attempt to reposition herself as the empowered woman walking away from toxicity. And maybe she is. Or maybe it's just another chapter in the cycle. Overshare, public backlash, reframe, reclaim. Either way, it's a smart move for Kendra, because she's giving her audience something they've been quietly craving since the middle parts of the story. Closure, or at least the illusion of it.
So when I got to my car, I was like, oh my gosh, like, what was that? And did he just say, see you next month? Because it was weird. So I go home, kind of rattled, just like, wow, that was intense. And I decided to write the email to my therapist. I'll put it right here. The one who had begged me to come in for another session, who was also having inappropriate boundary crossings with me. And so I just told her, I was like, look, I understand it was sudden, but if I were to come back in, it'd be more for you than for me. And I'm happy to fill out a form, right? Here, give me a form to fill out for your notes. And then she said, it's a part of my clinical integrity to invite you back in, to put your needs above mine? Your clinical integrity? Yeah.
Kendra's story is complicated, messy. It's a story that sits at the intersection of mental health, emotional obsession, professional ethics, and public storytelling. And whether you believe she was manipulated by a cunning psychiatrist or caught in a self-authored fantasy she projected onto an emotionally distant man, one thing is clear: there were serious boundary failures. And when both a psychiatrist and a therapist allow emotional dependence to deepen unchecked, when they don't name it, challenge it, or redirect it, patients like Kendra are left to write their own stories in the silence. Stories that sometimes spiral into performance. Stories that sometimes exploit the audience. And stories that, intentionally or not, can end up harming others. So here's the uncomfortable truth. You can feel sorry for Kendra and still question her narrative. You can believe she was emotionally harmed and still hold her accountable for how she's chosen to share that pain. Because trauma doesn't erase responsibility, and storytelling isn't the same thing as truth. Do you think Kendra's psychiatrist crossed a line? Was this emotional abuse or emotional projection? And how should we respond when someone shares a deeply personal story that doesn't fully add up? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep the discussion honest, nuanced, and respectful. If this kind of deep dive commentary interests you, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because we cover stories that live in the gray areas. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.